Get to know your LCSO. Information flows as learn and grow. With every episode we gotta know. Oh yeah, LCSO, let's go.
Hi, I'm Sheriff Mike Chapman. Welcome to another podcast episode of Get to Know Your LCSO. Today we're joined by Detective Shannon Almborg. She's one of our superstars there when it comes to investigating financial crimes. And we're going to get into that in just a little bit because it is a very complex area that we're now looking into, and it really goes well beyond what certainly when I started this profession, the types of investigations that we did. Because I mean, when you're talking about blockchains and cryptocurrency and cybercrime and all these other things, it really gets quite involved. Before we get into that, though, I want to just learn a little bit about you. You know, I want to find out kind of what got you involved in law enforcement, where you grew up. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I was actually really lucky. I was born in this area, but then my parents became missionaries when I was a kid. So they took us all overseas to Croatia, where I got to grow up in Croatia for about 10 years. Highly recommend it. It was a phenomenal experience. And then when we came back, I finished up my high school here and went to college, Northern Virginia, for a little bit, and then Mason to finish up my college career. And then went to the private sector for a little bit, just kind of doing some odd jobs, payroll, accounting, that type of thing. And I had an uncle, actually, who was a longtime law enforcement officer with Prince William County. And I always say, like, we always grew up asking him what I consider, like, cop questions. Like, what's the scariest call you've ever been on? And have you ever used your gun? And all that type of stuff. So we were at a family event, and I was asking him, like, your cop questions. Like, oh, tell me about something cool that happened on the job. And so we were chatting. He was just like, why don't you come do a ride-along with us? And I was like, sure, what is a ride-along? I'll do that. And so he was like, oh, just come out, hang out with us for a night. You'll ride with an officer and, we'll show you what it's like. And I was like, sure, that sounds fun. I have nothing better to do on a Friday night. So I did a ride-along and had a blast. Like, suddenly, we were running code to calls, and there's a guy with a knife, and then there was another check the welfare, and they had to clear a house. And, like, I got done with that night, and I was like, this is so much better than my office job. And I started applying to different agencies, and then thankfully got picked up by LCSO.
It is an interesting profession, and you actually made me think back of my dad was a Washington, D.C. detective when I was a little kid growing up. And I remember he came home with his car one day, his unmarked car, and he actually pretended like he let me get on the radio or whatever, and I thought, wow, that was really
so
cool.
Much fun, right?
Yeah, it was. So I grew up as well hearing cop stories and thought, wow, what an interesting job that would be. And not knowing if I was ever really going to do it, but then I decided I was going to do it, and I don't look back. I mean, I've been doing it for a long, long time. So I find it very interesting, and I can't think of a job more interesting than what we do. So how long have you been now with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office?
I've been with the Sheriff's Office for, I'll do math, about 13 years now.
Okay.
Yeah, I started in 2013, a couple years on the road, which was so much fun, had a blast. And then a little bit of time as an SRO, and then came to CID. And
Okay,
I've been
so
here ever since.
how long have you been in our investigations division?
For about 7 years now.
Okay.
Yeah, 7 years next month.
And when you started out, how did you start out in criminal investigations, and what led you to financial crimes?
So I've always been in the financial crimes unit. That's where I was put. And funnily enough, I didn't ask to be put there. I think my preference sheet had that, like, kind of towards the last end of where I wanted to go. But life has a way of working out anyways. Yeah. And to be honest, I love it. I love what I do. I love the work. It's a constant challenge. And where we started at 7 years ago and the types of cases we were working and how we were investigating them has changed dramatically. So I always tell people, like, my job with what we do shifts about every 6 months to a year. I'm doing something different. I'm looking at something new. There's a new investigative technique. And so it's kind of fun to always be challenged and not really know what's coming down the pipe.
Well, I know you're highly respected in what you do. And in fact, I know last June, just about a year ago, you were invited to speak at the National Sheriff's Association, the conference there. And I tell you what, the response that we got on that was phenomenal, quite frankly. Yeah, people were really, really impressed with the in-depth knowledge that you had when you did your presentation. Because quite frankly, it's evolving so quick, those financial crimes and the different scams that are going on and the way that people are moving money and cryptocurrency, that it's very, very hard to keep up with. And I look at these other agencies around, and I think most certainly state and local agencies like ours. Um, I think investigators, leaders are afraid to get into it because it's one of these crimes where it's very it's just hard to get to the bottom of it, and then and it, sometimes it involves just an enormous amount of money, and it's just kind of complex to try to navigate your way around it. And even and when I look at federal agencies with the thresholds that they have, it's hard to get the help that you need to try to
Mm-hmm.
take care of the people that are really losing so much money, sometimes their life savings in some cases, so take us through. I mean, there's different types of scams that go on when it comes to financial crimes. Give us an example of a couple and what to look out for and what you would advise as a preventive measure, to our citizens here to try to keep them from falling into one of these crimes, because it's one thing if you can prevent it is
Mm-hmm.
actually where you want to go, because these are hard to prosecute. But if you can tell us what to look out for, what they should look out for, and ways that we can prevent it before we actually have to get tasked with investigating.
Yeah, I think I mean there's always the scams are always evolving. They're changing, constantly and um y- some of the more common ones that we've been seeing an uptake in this for probably the last 2.5 years, and where we get still a lot of reports, is what I call the jury duty scam, or the police impersonation scam, where we have a lot of citizens who are getting called, um, oftentimes with a number that shows up on their phone that says Loudoun County Sheriff's Office. And when they pick up the phone and they talk to a person who identifies as, I'm Deputy so and so with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office, I'm Lieutenant, whatever it is with the Sheriff's Office, and they tell our victims, you've missed jury duty, and now there's a warrant for your arrest, and if you want to avoid being arrested, you have to pay a bond. And so they're starting to use all these terms that we in law enforcement, use and are used to, but for the citizens who don't know how this works, it sounds legit. They're using the terms bond, or warrant, jury duty, and suddenly, it generates a level of fear, which is completely normal. And so the scam evolves to, you have to pay this bond,
Right.
and they will even send documents to the victims where it looks like there is a warrant.
Do they do that by, well, first of all, how do they do the phone to make it look like it's coming from us?
They spoof the number, which is unfortunately fairly easy to do. They can make the number, look like it's coming from the sheriff's office, from FTIC, from DEA, from CBP, anyone they want to. We have a lot of, on that thread, as a little side note, we have a lot of what we call tech support scams, where it looks like it's coming from Amazon or Geek Squad or
Right.
something like that. So they spoof the number to make it look like it's legitimate. And so
And so when they send a document,
Mhm.
okay, that says that looks legit, so
Yeah.
it'll look like it's coming from the sheriff's office or coming from the court or
Mhm.
whatever. Do they send that? Do they do it by text? Do they do it by email? How do they usually do that?
Normally by text, sometimes by email. And even the email, it'll come from, something like courts at, you know, and then they'll use a domain, that last part of the email, that makes it look or sound legitimate,
Right.
right? It's actually, not a legitimate domain that's not associated with, us or the courts or Loudoun County at all. But, they do all of these things to, bypass the kind of red flag notices that we would normally get in
Mhm.
situations like this. And then when you combine all the sophisticated acts that they're doing with, sounding really legitimate on the phone, they're using the terms like we would use in law enforcement. They're saying words like 10-4 and copy that, and
Right.
let me talk to you. I'm going to put you on the phone with my lieutenant, and they're making them sound legitimate, and then they
Right.
back that up with, here are all these documents that look official,
Right.
saying that you have a warrant for your arrest, saying that there's a $80,000 bond that you have to pay. It's naturally so generates a certain level of trust and fear
Right.
in the person who's on the receiving end. Um, so they'll go and they'll direct the victims to take money out of their bank account, and then they will direct them to go to a cryptocurrency ATM, purchase the cryptocurrency, and then it sends it, and then scan a QR code that sends that cryptocurrency directly to the scammers.
So when we're looking at going to a cryptocurrency or going to an ATM that does deals in cryptocurrency, and I know we've taken some efforts, made some efforts in putting notices up. What do those notices tell the people to do?
Really just stop,
Right.
take a second, stop. It lets them know that law enforcement is never going to ask you to pay, to get out of a warrant. That's not an option people have. Certainly, we're never going to ask you to pay in cryptocurrency, but to be honest, we've asked victims who, report to us, and, really thankful for ones that do, because I think there is a stigma for victims when they have something like this happen. And, they're not only feeling like bad because they just lost money, but there's a whole level of feeling of like shame and guilt involved because they think they should have recognized the signs. They should have been smarter than this. And how could they fall for this? And, so there's a hesitancy, I think, to report these types of scams to us. So, but the ones that do, and I'm very thankful they do, we've asked them like, hey, do you see the sign? And some of them say yes, most of them say no. And the reason for that is the scammers don't let you off the phone. So from the time they call you, you are on the phone with them the entire time. They will tell you, we need your mileage, and you need to keep track of your mileage and update us so often. When you go into the bank to withdraw your money, put us on mute, but keep the phone on and in your pocket so we can monitor your movement. If we think you're going off course, we're going to send a cop out to arrest you, right? So they get these victims in this complete state of like control and fear, that when they do go to the ATMs, even if the signs that we put out there are there, sometimes they're so focused on, let me just do what needs to be done so I can make this go away. I can pay the bond and I'm not going to be arrested, right? That they don't even notice the signs half the time.
So I went to a prayer group meeting about a year and a half ago, and one of the people that were there was telling me that his mom was really, really embarrassed because her entire life savings was $800,000 from a scam like this.
Yeah.
She was up in Connecticut, and there was a federal agency who was asked to investigate. I don't know if it met the threshold. They weren't real happy with that. I did make a special request to have something done with that. But I know that there are certain thresholds, and it's hard. It's hard because the money, but it was really bad for certainly people of, my age, a little bit older, that that aren't, really very savvy when it comes to, the internet and cell phones and crypto. And I mean, to us, it's still like a very foreign thing. And so it's easy to take advantage of certainly the elderly people in this, because they, and I know her son tried to get involved, but it was like too late. And he's like, Mom, why didn't you tell me about this? I would have told you not to do this and that. But they're so convincing, like you said. I mean, they'll talk in cop talk. They'll talk, yeah. So you mentioned, the jury duty scams. What other kinds of scams have you seen?
So the one that probably is the one that we still get a lot of reports, but it accounts for the biggest total loss to the victims, is what we call a pig butchering scam. And I know it's like a terrible word, but that word comes from the Chinese translation. They call it shazupan, right? In Chinese, that translates to pig butchering. And it's a type of cryptocurrency investment scam. And it starts multiple different ways. And I bet you've gotten these exact same text messages, and I know I have, where, you get a text message out of the blue saying, hey, Cindy, let's meet for lunch tomorrow. Are we still on for lunch? And you respond back, well, I'm not Cindy. I don't know. You think you have the wrong number. We call them wrong number text messages. But that's just the start of it. Starts that conversation. And the scammers are really good. They have scripts. They know exactly what scripts to follow. And they'll follow their script and slowly guide the victim down this path of hey, this is the scammer talking like, this is what I do. I invest in cryptocurrency. I have an uncle who knows how, and he teaches me how to do it, and I make all this money. And they're really slick about how they do it, because they never come right out and say, I made all this money with cryptocurrency and you can too, right? They'll be really subtle about it. They'll send pictures of, shopping in New York City with all these brand name shopping bags, or a picture of a really fancy high-rise apartment. So they're creating this illusion that, without actually outright saying it, right, that, you know, they're very wealthy and they've made a lot of money thanks to cryptocurrency. And that draws the victim in, right? And so when they're like, hey, would you like to try it to start? Like, we can guide you through it too, and you can have this lifestyle, you know. Even and this one honestly gets people, you know, you mentioned for the older generation, it gets a lot of them too. But we have younger people who are doing this as well, and because it's a very sophisticated scam.
Right.
So, you know, you get drawn in and they're told, hey, go create an account on this platform, this trading platform. So you'll go to the trading platform and it's going to be really slick looking. It's going to look amazing. You can have like scrolling lines across the bottom, almost like the stock exchange, right? Where you see like the price of cryptocurrency. And so they'll guide them through this whole process, step by step, creating an account on this trading platform, you know, purchasing cryptocurrency at a legitimate exchange, right? Like a real company, which just goes to solidify this idea that this is a real, legitimate, you know, company, business, prospect. You know, they'll transfer the cryptocurrency to their trading platform account. And it shows up, right? They go to this trading platform, which, you know, is completely fake. Like nothing on that is real. But the money shows up there. The cryptocurrency shows up there.
Right.
And they start clicking the buttons and doing the things that they're directed to do, and they see that value increase. And a lot of people will, you know, will test it out first, right? So a lot of people will be like, well, this seems a little weird. Let me test it out. Let me send $500. So they send $500. They see the value grow a little bit, and then they're like, still skeptical. Let me make a small withdrawal. The scammers allow them to make that withdrawal and will facilitate that on the back end side.
Right.
And that money, you know, that crypto goes back to their Coinbase account or whatever exchange they have.
Right.
And they're able to withdraw that all the way back to their bank. So they're like, okay, this works. Like I tested it. I got my money in. I was able to get it out. Let's try this out. And so, you know, and it just continues on. So they send more money. The value seems to grow. And suddenly $100,000 investment is looking like $2 million. And it's when they go to make a really large withdrawal that, you know, suddenly their account's going to be frozen and they can't make the withdrawal. And they're going to be told, oh, you know, you have to pay a fee to withdraw your assets. And it changes from, it could be any, you know, an AML, anti-money laundering fee, or a customs fee, or taxes, or they will make up a reason why you have to pay more, right, into the platform. And even if the victims do that, they're still not able to withdraw their assets. And kind of at that point is when they realize, like, I think I've been scammed, and they report it to, hopefully they report it to law enforcement.
So they create, in essence, like fake ledgers, almost like what Bernie Madoff did, you know, years ago when he, you know, he did his scams. But this is all online, so they're getting all these fake ledgers.
Yeah, and you know, we live in a world like we create accounts online all the time for everything, right? So it's not, you know, creating an account on a platform is not a red flag. Right. And they do the little test to see if they can withdraw it, and that works. So that, you know, that red flag kind of that you would think is gone. So yeah, but everything, unfortunately, everything they're seeing on their, I call it their like trading platform, which is completely fake. It, you know, is completely.
So take us through the process here. Okay, so somebody goes to a you know, crypto ATM, and they do that. They do the money transfer, and then doesn't it go through like a blockchain series, and then where does it go? Yeah.
That's a great question. So cryptocurrency is fairly unique because it was, I mean, harkening back to when it was created, right? You're talking like 2008, I think the first block was mined, if you want to go back to that time frame. It was created to kind of act in lieu of fiat currency, or like US dollars, what we think of like US dollars or euros or whatever, fiat currency. And it was designed to be what we call like anonymous or pseudo-anonymous, right? So you could transact without going through all of the, you know, the institutions that we have to go through, like the banks and, you know, all the regulations and everything else like that. And, you know, obviously it's cryptocurrency, I just want to be clear, is not in and of itself bad. But like anything in life, right? Bad guys are always going to use what they can to, you know, scam people and take their cut. But the difference in cryptocurrency versus like US dollars, right, is that cryptocurrency operates on what we call blockchains, which are really, it's just a fancy word for a really big ledger book that documents every single transaction, every send, every receive, everything. And everyone can see that. That's open for anyone in the world to see those transactions happening. So because of that, as law enforcement, when we're investigating a case involving cryptocurrency, I don't need to get records from the bank, wait for the bank to give me those records back, and then from there I can see what happened to the money, right? With cryptocurrency, I can just jump onto the blockchain, and because everything is an open book and I can see every transaction,
Mm-hmm.
I can find the victim's transaction and I can start kind of following the money, so to speak.
Okay, and there are times when can you intercept at any point in the blockchain to try to get money back? I mean, I know there's two things that you try to look at here. One is whether you're going to be able to prosecute
Mm-hmm.
somebody, and I know it gets so diluted over time,
Mm-hmm.
like when it goes through all these different elements there. But there are times when you're able to actually recover. Correct?
Yeah, and we are sometimes able to, kind of jump in and do, and freeze assets and, work to try to recover them. We have on many occasions partnered with federal entities to help with that process as well. But I will say it's still hard to do. And it's, unfortunately, what I tell my victims, in the first conversation I have with them, is, that is my number one goal when I get a case is to, can I intercept the assets anywhere? Is there any possibility for me to freeze them and maybe try to, recover them for you? That is my number one goal. Unfortunately, with how fast these transactions happen, that's very, very unlikely, you know, and, because of the way it works, for instance, if I wanted to send using US dollars, you know, money to somebody over in Europe, right? I could do that. And but the systems in place that we have to send that money over to someone in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, wherever, they take time to do because they're going through these centralized banks and institutions, right? And so that whole process slows it all down. So it could take a couple of days to process a transaction from me over to, Australia or somewhere else. Cryptocurrency doesn't operate in that type of centralized authority. So I could send cryptocurrency to someone in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and that transaction processes anywhere in seconds
Mm-hmm.
to a couple of minutes, right? So, having the opportunity to intercept those assets somewhere along the way is very difficult because of the speed of which these transactions move. And
Right.
also just because, we're still looking at, a fact that it's operating on a blockchain where it's pretty anonymous. It's
Right.
pseudo-anonymous, right? So it's hard to figure out even where you can intercept them.
I think we're probably one of the few local agencies that actually does this type of investigation. And I know, so tell us a little bit about that, what it took to get up to speed on these things. And I know we also work with, the FBI and others and what their, like their thresholds are, or I don't know if that's giving out too much information, but we don't want the bad guys to say
Yeah.
we can take it up to a certain limit. But there is so much of this going on, and we want to make sure we're doing everything in our power to try to get money back to people. And it's hard to like you mentioned to actually prosecute because it goes through so many different avenues before to complete the transaction.
Right.
But we do make an effort. So you have any examples or you can talk about there where we've been able to get?
Yeah, we've had a couple of cases, where we've been able to, and, and we're very, very grateful these happened and super blessed, but, where we've been able to intercept assets. We've been able to do recoveries. Sometimes they're as small as a couple $1,000s worth of assets. Sometimes, our biggest one a couple of years ago was, like 1.3, 1.4 million. In terms of, where the state is in Virginia. Virginia as a state is slowly coming up to speed on doing these types of investigations. The difficulty is that this is not something we learn about in in the academy of how to do
Right, right,
cryptocurrency investigations, right? So there's now a decent amount of training out there, but it's not mainstream. So you have to know where to go to find it. You have to know, who knows about this, where you can, contact them and ask questions. And, that started out for us in my unit in 2020 is when all of this started. In 2020, we started getting our first cryptocurrency cases. And I remember getting them and being like, cryptocurrency, that's not really a thing. That's fake. I don't know what this
right.
is. This is weird. And I can't really do anything with it because, all I know is that once it's gone, it's gone. And so that was sort of like, unfortunately, our answer because we didn't know better at the time. And then in 2021, we started changing our mindset because it was like, okay, we can't do anything with cryptocurrency, but let's be creative and figure out what else we can do to investigate. And in 2022, we got what I consider like our first big case. I got a victim who lost $2 million through an account takeover and $2 million worth of cryptocurrency. And I took that case and I went to our federal partners at the FBI and I was like, I don't really know what to do, but something needs to be done. Like the answer of we can't do this is not just good enough anymore. We need to figure out a solution. So, they were able to give me a lot of resources to help me learn how to do these investigations. And suddenly I realized, what do you mean this stuff is traceable, right? Like, what do you mean you can intercept this stuff somewhere along the way? And so, I had my first successful freeze and seizure working that case in 2022 in partnership with the FBI. And so our capacities there just kept growing and expanding as our unit learned how to, investigate these types of cases. But that's a hard process to do, and it takes a lot of time and resources that a lot of agencies in Virginia aren't necessarily equipped to handle right now, or don't have the time, money, or resources.
So I know this is a topic of federal legislation, of state legislation. Do you think what's the legislation that's being proposed or where this is going to make it actually harder for us, or is it going to loosen the reins on cryptocurrency, or is it going to require? Or do you think it's going to require more reporting and make it a little bit easier for us to investigate these?
So I think on the whole, the legislation that's going down, at least for the state level, like the state, I believe it just passed, don't quote me on that, but there was a bill, I believe it was signed and maybe effective this July or next July, that was regulating cryptocurrency ATMs. And I love the bill. I love what it says and how much protection it gives to victims of fraud in that bill, and the regulations that it imposes on cryptocurrency ATMs. So stuff like that is incredibly helpful for law enforcement because it does a lot to kind of try to stop the scam on the front end,
Right.
which is the number one goal, right? We would rather people just not,
Sure.
lose their money. And so that stuff like that is incredibly helpful. I know there's a lot of discussion on the federal side, with like the Clarity Act and some other stuff going on here, and people have pros and cons on either side. But really, the stuff that kind of regulates the industry does make it easier for law enforcement to, I think, conduct an investigation and be more successful.
That's a lot of information, and I'm going to kind of close out with this. I think, first of all, it's when I look at this, the complexities involved and the outstanding work that you're doing and your section is doing, and the fact that you make the extra effort to try to get money back for the victims of these crimes, because I think there's this notion that if you can't arrest somebody, it's not worth going after, and we feel here at the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office like anybody that's losing money on these things, we're going to do everything we can in our power to get that money back. But now, as we close out the broadcast here, tell us from a public service announcement, what would you want people out there to know to watch out for? I mean, we kind of went over it, but like if you were to synopsize what message you want to get out there to the people that might fall prey, might fall victim to this, what would you want to say?
So I think that there's two main messages I would hope that people listening to this would kind of take to heart. Is one, it is not your fault. You are not to blame for this happening, and you are not alone in this. There's a lot of victims who feel, that they are to blame or they did something wrong, and I want them to know that that's not the case at all.
Right.
The second thing is, there's three things I want them to know. The second thing is, if you are a victim, please report it and report it as soon as possible. The faster that we get those reports and the information in there, the higher possibility or likelihood it is that we could possibly have a positive impact in, our main goal, which is, trying to recover assets where we can. And then finally, in terms of what to watch out for, we talked about some of the red flags that are out there for these different scams. But we also talked about how easy some of the scammers, how good the scammers are at kind of mitigating those red flags. So they don't necessarily pop up in someone's head when they're in the middle of a situation. But what is fairly consistent across the different scams is that the bad guys, the scammers, will instill in this victim, in this person, a sense of like urgency, right? Or fear, where you have to act now. Don't talk to anyone else. Stay on the phone with me. You have to do this right now. Drop what you're doing. And that sense of urgency, that sense of like that emotional side where you're feeling like I have, like stress because you have to do something right now. If you're feeling that way and someone's telling you what to do and you're feeling this sense of urgency,
Yeah,
stop,
slow down.
pause,
Yeah.
right? Take a breath, go to, your nearest sheriff's office location,
Sure.
and we will help you out.
Well, I want to thank you. That's a lot of information here, and it's great advice here for our people out there that are watching this podcast. And you're doing a terrific job.
Thank
Your
you.
section's doing a terrific job. We really appreciate what you're doing. I think the citizens here, I sometimes don't know or don't think they realize how much work we do on the back end to try to keep them safe and try to make sure that we're getting the right messages out here. But this is a great example of a way to get a little bit more detail so people understand what this is all about, and hopefully they'll watch this podcast and say, "Oh, okay, I got to watch out
I
for
hope
this
so,
and that."
yeah.
So I want to thank you for being here, and I wish you all the best and keep up the great work. Thanks,
Awesome.
Shannon.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.